Kyle,
So
I'm gonna bring this chat up because it goes back to something you literally texted me before we went live.
sure.
From Chet Chisholm says, ask any of the veterans from Afghanistan about Bacha Bazi and how
Yep.
happy they are that we brought those who practice it home with them. And that is a sarcastic face emoji.
Yeah.
I only knew what those words meant because you literally texted me a link before we went live. Let's finish it on this because I don't want to use your entire afternoon up on a Thanksgiving weekend.
Sure.
What is Bacha Bazi?
It is a pedophilic, pederastic practice that is outlawed but still takes place in Afghanistan and some other Islamic areas. And it is essentially the practice of getting like boy toys together. They take either adolescent males, young adolescent or mid-adolescent males. They're all under the age of majority and consent for our purposes. And they are groomed essentially by men. I've heard it called chai boys in other areas too. They use that term, and that was fairly frequently discussed by the soldiers we were dealing with. We had one of these cases. So what they're done is you get a bunch of grown men who are in their 30s and they have a beard like me, and they've been fighting a war for the last.
They're raping young boys.
Yeah, they're raping them. They basically groom the guy along. They give them gifts, but they're the dancing boy, and they're the sort of like their mascot in the way that we used to think of some pretty awful stuff that the Greeks may have done. So they take these boys, and then they all have their way with them because the women are for breeding, but boys are for fun is sort of the mindset as I read it. And I dealt with this explicitly when I was at Holloman Air Force Base. We had a case of a 17-year-old boy who was probably 16 when they grabbed him. And he was from the city. So he was kind of like more westernized and more Western sensibilities. And we had members of, and this is relevant to the shooting that happened the other day, as far as I can tell, we had members of what's called the Coast Province Force, or KPF, which was a militia group or a paramilitary group that the CIA had both trained and worked with extensively in capture kill missions. And these guys were, killers. They're in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s, grizzled war vets that spent their entire life in conflict. And they took these guys in, and these guys basically found themselves a boy toy while they were coming into the United States through one of these refugee flights. And they separated him from his brothers. He had a brother that was like 21 and another brother was like 24, 25, something like that. So they were in their 20s. This kid was 17. And they basically beat the shit out of these guys and ran him off, took him with them, took him up to the ID desk, said he's 19, fill out his paperwork. They filled out the paperwork, said he was 19. As a 19-year-old, he was treated like a grown-up. And so he was kept with the KPF guys. And then he was sent off to Holloman Air Force Base while his brothers ended up at another facility up in New Jersey and eventually with an uncle out in Virginia. So we've got this kid who is underage and he's being held essentially prisoner by dozens of grown fighters. And they would always surround him with a half dozen guys. There would always be someone watching him. He was stuck in his bunk. And then when they wanted to go and engage in their sexual assaults and their rape, they would booze him up. They would give him alcohol. They would take him to one of the places that was like not being observed, whether it was in the bathrooms, the showers, or the things, run everybody else out, stand guard. And then they would abuse this kid. And, one of the hardest things I've ever done is sexual assault interviews are always difficult to do. And I've done a handful of them, not a lot, but a handful. Doing one through a translator and a cultural boundary where I don't know what's faux pas in his culture or what the likelihood of him talking is, but having multiple people come and share with us what they thought was happening. These are the NGO workers and people that were in the military that were seeing what was happening. And we actually had to go do a hostile extraction of this guy. David, we rolled into this tent scenario.
This is in New Mexico.
This is in New Mexico. This is in freaking U.S. soil on an Air Force base.
Hostile extraction, which is to save the boy.
Correct.
From being raped by.
I'm gonna tell you what, and it sounds like freaking cartoonish.
It sounds like out of Taken is what it sounds like.
It was one of the craziest things that I've probably done in my life, in so much as I had made up my mind that if need be, I was going to shoot a couple of people dead on the streets, the dusty street of an Air Force base, which is a really strange thing to have committed to, but I was. And so I talked to the first sergeant on the base, and he and I are discussing this, and he tells me the whole scenario and what it is, and they've got a place set up where they can debrief him, and he can be safe, but we have to extract him. And I was like, what is your plan? He was like, I want to get a couple of security forces airmen, which was funny. They brought like 2 females. They were they had M4s or whatever, but I was like, really? We're going to bring ladies with us? We're about to go to dudes who have been killing people for their whole life. So we go in there, and I'm just so people understand, I'm wearing like a Wrangler shirt. I've got a white Stetson on because that's how I rolled around in New Mexico.
I don't know what either of those 2 things are.
A cowboy hat. It's a white.
And the Wrangler shirt is what, like plaid?
No, it's just like a button, like a snap-on button shirt, like a cowboy shirt.
Okay.
And I had jeans on and I had my gun belt on. So I have a leg rig with my Glock 19 and extra magazines and my handcuffs and a med kit and like all my crap that I would use when I would go on arrest warrants. Because a lot of times when I did stuff on the Indian reservation, it's just me walking out there. So it's like a duty belt. So I'm wearing boots, jeans, Wrangler shirt, Stetson, and I walk into this place, and I'm not very tall like you. Like I'm 5'8", so I'm not particularly intimidating.
You're a monster to me, Kyle.
But when I look people in the eye, and I've decided that like I'm fine with them not walking another step, that I think it does translate, and it did that day. And we went in there and we found this boy, 17-year-old boy, on a cot, with his backpack, and 5 men in the middle of the day for no particular reason, standing guard around his little section, his little cubby in the tent. These are like maybe chest high walls, like you can see over them, but they're little chest high, it's kind of like cubicle areas. Okay. On the other side of the tent, another 20 of these guys are meeting with CIA case officers that we knew were CIA case officers who were not supposed to be debriefing people on US soil at that moment, but were because it was a free for all. And they're getting intel and they're giving these guys tablets and money and stuff like that and trying to get what they can. And there's 5 of these dudes who are standing guard. And we walked in, and me and the first sergeant was actually an 1811. He was a HSI agent and he was a guardsman. So he was activated for military, but he did what I did regularly. And the two of us walked in there. He had a couple years on me and like a real stout mustache, kind of bald head, Sergeant Slaughter looking guy. And the two of us walked in there and we just said, like, get the F out of the way. And they kind of looked at us and we pushed him out of the way. We walked in, we grabbed the kid. We said, grab whatever your stuff is. We had an interp say, okay, get your backpack. So he puts his backpack on. He looks absolutely terrified. And then we pulled him out physically. And I had him walk with the first sergeant. They put, 4 armed guards on all sides of him and walked him out like in a protective thing. And these men started following. And I'm watching them. And so we're walking and they're following us out of the tent. And when we got out of the tent, I said, are you guys going to turn a corner at some point down that street? And he goes, yeah. I go, you walk. I'm standing here. I'm just going to stare these guys down. And if they try to come at me, I'm going to kill them. And he goes, okay, understood. Yeah, that's probably a good plan. He's like, do you want me to leave anybody? I was like, get the kid out of here. Like they're not, they're unarmed as far as I can tell. So that's what's going to happen next. And I stood there in the middle of a freaking dusty street, which you saw the dust. It was a smaller, narrower version, tents on all sides. And I kid you not, like 8 men stood there who came out of there. And a couple of his buddies came from the CIA little meeting. And they got to the point where about 15 of them or 20 of them are standing at the end of the street.
It's like
and they're
Black Hawk Down type situation.
They're leering at me and they're laughing and they're saying things kind of quietly to each other and stuff like that. And they're watching their kid, their 17-year-old, chai boy walk down the street with these airmen. And they turned a corner and they went away. And these guys kind of moved. And I said it in English and I don't know if they could understand it or not. I said, if any of you step closer, step any closer, I'm going to fucking shoot you right here on the street. And I had my hand just kind of resting on my gun casually. Like I was ready to go. It's like, okay, if I need to start killing people, I'm going to start killing people. And I had enough rounds to get all of them. And that was the decision I made there. And I guess they took me at my word for it because I looked them right in the eye and they all kind of waited. And when the kid was gone and I got a text message, I looked down, I see the text and they're like, okay, we've gone into a secure location. I ducked down an alley and just kind of turned to the right where they didn't follow me. And I looked over my shoulder and they didn't keep walking. I'd never seen anything like that in my entire life. The balls on those guys and the entitlement because we're taking their toy.
They're anal raping the kid. I'm not trying to be grotesque. This is they're using the kid for that type of sex.
Yeah.
When you extract the kid, does he need medical attention?
No, he was screwed up. And I mean, we spent hours debriefing him and talking to him and he didn't want to admit. And then he kind of did. And I was like, look, man, like you're never going to have to go and see those men again. I personally will guarantee it. If I have to physically take you out of here, I will. And we got him, the first sergeant, like I said, he also worked with DHS. So we got DHS on the line and they managed to get him out within maybe 8 or 9 hours of us pulling him. So we held on to him. We stayed there and then they put him on a plane and they flew him to his uncle, who was his supporting sponsor. He went to family and that guy was like a productive member of society. He had a store.
They flew him to family in America.
Yeah, in Virginia.
Now, I mean, I don't know if you follow up with this person because, some people are going to say that type of trauma is going to, revert to the generational trauma of.
Oh, I'm sure there's all kinds of problems. I did not. It wasn't. I was removed from the FBI not long afterwards. So this was one of my last things that I did on duty while I was working for. This was one of the last things I did before I told them I wouldn't take the COVID swab. They wanted me to swab my nose for COVID 3 times a week. And I said, I don't consent to that. And they said, well, you have to come to work. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. So what do you want to do next? And they kicked me out of the office for 4 months or 3 months. And then when I got back in, I lost my job in the on the Indian reservation. I got assigned to sit at a desk for 6 weeks. And then they took my badge and my gun after I sat around for 6 weeks waiting to be fired, which eventually I was. So all of that was like, this is like the last stuff that I did when I was working for the Bureau. And I thought it was pretty righteous stuff. And if I only save one person in my life, like in that scenario, that's fine. But it was seriously knowing that those guys out there, and there's dozens of them on that base that I saw, which means that there were hundreds on that base. There were 10,000 people there. And then multiply that by 7 sites, 8 sites, 10 sites, something like that. We brought in thousands of little boy rapers into this country. And that's what I said to the FBI. And I actually have a tape of it. When they called to try to interrogate me, which they did, I lost my mind on this woman. And I told her, I said, you don't even know what you're talking about, but I've watched our agency basically turn a blind eye, and they didn't let us prosecute. We didn't have any way to prosecute. They're like, well, saving the kid is basically all you can do. We can't go after these guys. That's like, they shouldn't be in my country. Or one of those days, I'm going to run into one of those guys, or you're going to run into one of those guys on the street, or some airmen or some National Guardsmen will run into them on the street in Washington, D.C., apparently, because they all got brought here through process, and they all had worked with our government through the CIA or other agencies. They'd been interps and so on. Their culture was incompatible with ours, which was always the problem. And so I shared all this with my congresswoman at the time. She just wasn't reelected. So it didn't go anywhere when it got to Jim Jordan's office, but it did go to there as far as I know. And this is the reason why people are always like, why are you so mad? It's like, because I saw a bunch of really awful stuff. A predictable consequence was bad things that would happen to Americans in America. And nobody seemed to care for all of their big talk on Fox News.